The shuttle descended through a curtain of cloud and rain, and the world that rose to meet Serenya was smaller than the sky she carried in her mind. Windows, not towers. Gardens, not domes. A crisscross of streets that looked stitched by hand. She pressed her palm to the cool glass and felt the faint hum of the vessel as it settled on a tarmac beside a building with a painted sign, a single-story school. Red brick, ringed by trees that leaned like quiet sentinels in the wind. It was not what she had been promised. It was not what she had been trained to expect. The door hissed open. Earth air poured in wet leaves, dust, something warm like bread. The government liaison smiled with a practiced politeness and said, "The assignment had been arranged with care." "Observer," he repeated, as if the word were a suitable container for her life's work. She had imagined laboratories. She had studied Earth through sterile catalogs of data and assumed the first handshake would be with a scientist who spoke in equations. Instead, a man waited under the school's portico, a teacher with a coffee cup and a rain-darkened jacket. He held himself with the easy steadiness of someone who knew how to be patient. "Daniel Ward," he said, offering his hand. "Welcome to Riverfield Elementary." Serenya did not take the hand. She turned to the small figure by her side, adjusting the hood over Lyra's hair, careful not to brush the faint luminescent threads along the girl's temple. Lyra leaned against her hip without a sound, eyes searching the raindrops as if the weather might speak. She was small, even for her age, by human measures, fine-boned pale, with the strange stillness that came from carrying too much inside. In another life, on another world, Lyra would have been surrounded by the song of memory elders breathing old stars into the new. But Serenya's people were fading. What they could no longer store in the communal lattice had been woven into a child, a single fragile vessel. And the child had gone quiet. "Class starts in 10 minutes, Daniel said, voice low enough to be gentle, without being soft. "You can stay as long as you like. Observe." He borrowed the liaison's word and, somehow, made it less offensive. Inside, the hallways glowed with the kind of light that never really exists in laboratories. Posters with crooked edges spoke of fractions and field trips. Children's voices bounced like small birds. Lyra's fingers tightened around Serenya's sleeve for a moment, then slid away. She walked beside Daniel, her feet careful on the tile, as if sound might break something. Serenya cataloged the environment automatically. Sensory load, exits, sources of potential threat. The hum she attended to most, however, was inside Lyra, the faint, intermittent signal of the encoded archive that had not opened since the crossing. It was there, like a star behind a cloud. It did not answer when she called. Daniel guided them to a classroom. The door was propped open by a stack of books with worn spines, and the chalkboard along the far wall had been half-raced a gray smear of arithmetic fading under a dusty handprint. The smell of chalk was unfamiliar to Serenya, yet it stirred something like memory. Ancient caves on distant moons where ancestors marked the shape of constellations with ash. "This is where we work," Daniel said. "Today, we're reading stories about journeys." Serenya's mouth thinned. She folded her hands behind her back to keep from revealing the tremor that belonged not to her body, but to the part of her that was merely a mother. "My brief did not mention stories. I require a quiet room, diagnostic instruments, access to your medical imaging. You'll have quiet," he said, "and more." He crouched to speak to Lyra, leaving 2 feet of space and the option of silence between them. "You can sit wherever you like. No rush." Lyra did not answer. Her gaze had drifted toward the side table where a yellow box held chalk sticks, a handful of small, powdery cylinders that light made soft. Daniel noticed the direction of her eyes and slid the box closer to the chalkboard with one palm. No invitation attached, no permission required. He and the children moved through their morning rituals. The class began like a tide, everyone lifting into their own small tasks. Serenya stood near the back, unobserved in seeing everything. She took note of how Daniel greeted each child by name, how he assigned dignity with the same ease with which he assigned seats. She did not understand how any of this was meant to help. Time stretched. Lyra did not join a table, did not lift a pencil. She simply stood near the board, so quiet that quiet settled around her like a shell. Eventually, when even the liaison's phone had fallen silent, Lyra reached toward the chalk. She tested its weight. White dust kissed her fingertips. She stepped closer to the slate and drew a point of light. One dot, then another, a triangle. A curve that did not follow any of Earth's familiar sky. Serenya straightened without meaning to. Lyra's hand moved more quickly, the lines gathering into a pattern whose rhythm Serenya recognized not with her eyes but with the bone-deep recognition of someone hearing the first notes of a lost song. It was not random. It was the first thread of the lattice, an ancient index that, in her people's earliest days, had taught the young where to look when the night was too large. She had begged the archive to open aboard the ship. She had sung to it with the old sounds she barely remembered. Nothing. Now, a dusty stick and a black wall were coaxing it forth. Daniel saw the change that rippled through Serenya before he fully understood the significance of the drawing. He stepped closer, as if approaching a bird. "It's beautiful," he said, because that was the truth available to him. And truth was something children could feel, even when they did not yet have words. "What do you call it?" Lyra's mouth parted. Sound hovered and stuttered. She placed a dot to the left of the curve, then drew a thin bridge between that dot and the heart of the pattern. Her lips shaped a word from another language, and then trembling, almost astonished by herself, translated in a whisper that belonged more to the world than to anyone in it. Light. The chalk scratched like sand under a tide. Serenya could not move. The ache in her chest loosened into something perilously close to faith. Daniel's eyes lifted, meeting hers, and for a second, only a second, there was an understanding between them that bypassed the pomp of introductions and the defensive armor of expertise. He did not look at Lyra like a puzzle to be solved, or a prize to be guarded. He looked at her like a person who had been waiting for someone to notice she was there. "Stories about journeys," he murmured again, barely audible. "Seems we picked the right lesson." Serenya almost told him that this, here, sitting on a chalkboard like a spilled constellation, was not merely a story. It was the beginning of an unlocking that could save a civilization. But the words stayed behind her teeth. Naming this too soon felt like laying hands on a prayer before it had finished forming. Instead, she watched. Instead, she allowed a very old fear to ease a fear that her training and her precision would never be enough to reach the child she loved. Maybe the path to memory did not run only through instruments and scans. Maybe it ran through trust, through small rituals of ordinary mornings, through a teacher's attention and a box of chalk. The rain slowed. Sunlight slipped in, turning the chalk dust into a light, domestic stardust that floated above the desks. Lyra drew the last line of her pattern, then leaned her forehead to the board for a breath, as if the slate were cool rock against a fever. When she stepped back, the shape held. Serenya recognized its geometry and its cadence, and the scholar in her jolted fully awake. This was a map that did not belong to Earth. This was the first door in a corridor of doors. She met Daniel's eyes again, and in that glance lived an apology she could not say yet, and a thanks she did not know how to offer. "I thought this placement was a mistake," she admitted softly, surprising herself with the humility in her voice. He shrugged, as if the day had not tilted, as if whole histories were not hanging from a child's steady hand. "Sometimes the world sends us to the right room by telling us the wrong reason," he said. "You'll see." Serenya looked at Lyra, the fragile pulse at her throat, the chalk stripe across her fingers, the fierce precision of the lines on the board. She had come to Earth as an observer. shielded by logic and the last scraps of pride from a dying people. Now she stood in a small-town classroom, realizing that the science she sought might bloom in the soil of story and patience, and that the first true instrument of her mission was not a machine at all, but a human who knew how to listen. Outside, children spilled into the hallway for lunch. Inside, the room held the hush that follows the moment something important finally begins. Serenya stepped closer to her daughter, close enough to touch, but not touching, and felt the archive's sleeping light stir like a creature awaking to a name. She let herself breathe. She let herself believe. The chalk pattern on the board glittered where the sun struck, a quiet promise. Serenya did not know yet the shape of the battles ahead. She did not know why her heart had steadied when Daniel spoke, or why the way he stepped back from Lyra foring space. Not pressure made her feel less alone than she had in years. She only knew this. She had not been sent to the wrong room. Somewhere, very far from the red brick and the green trees, an old star listened. The rain burned itself out by afternoon, leaving the windows jeweled and the playground steaming as if the earth were breathing. In the classroom, the chalk constellation still glowed faintly in the slant of sun, and Lyra hovered near it, like a small moon tied by an invisible tide. The other children drifted past her with the unstudied grace of those who have already accepted wonder as part of the furniture. They compared lunches, traded pencils, invented games around the legs of their desks. Daniel moved among them, collecting stories about pets and cousins and a missing shoe, and somehow made those stories feel as important as the equations on the posters. Serenya stayed against the back wall and set her wristband to a narrow scan. She had calibrated its sensors a dozen times since they'd landed, but the reading spiking now was new, a soft harmonic, low and patient, blooming at the edge of the audible range every time Daniel's voice smoothed into a certain cadence. Not all words, not command tones. The band pulsed when his sentences ended on hope. She told herself it was coincidence. She told herself that music could not compete with mathematics. Yet when he knelt to straighten a child's paper and said, "Try again? You're closer than you think." The band warmed against her skin like a quiet affirmative. Lyra reached for the yellow chalk that small sun and added 3 points to the pattern she had drawn earlier. She stepped back, tilted her head the way Serenya's own mother had once done over the cradle lattice, and connected to points with a slender bridge. The bridge had a twitch in it, just enough to say river and not rope. Daniel watched, silent. After a while, he slid a stool to the side of the board, not quite facing Lyra. He sat, elbows on his knees, and looked at the window where a moth tested the glass. "Do you ever name them?" he asked, nodding toward the map. "We name ours. Here, Orion, Cassiopeia. Sometimes the names are like pockets you can put stories in." Lyra's fingers tightened around the chalk. She drew a tiny circle at the base of the bridge, and, very carefully, printed 4 human letters on the slate below it. Light. The eye wore a dot that could have been a star or a tear. She stared at the word as if unsure whether it was a bridge or a cliff. Daniel did not move. He made space for the silence to hold. Serenya's chest tightened around something tender and difficult, a shape that once would have been pride if she hadn't worn fear for so long that it had reshaped even the good feelings. "Stories aren't instruments," she said, more to herself than to him. "They can't open sealed architecture." He looked up at her, and there was nothing in his eyes that could be called argument. "Sometimes the door wasn't sealed," he said. "It was just waiting for someone to knock the right way." The liaison buzzed her with a message. 2 words, too casual, "Auditors tomorrow." She replied with the most formal version of the word understood that her language allowed, then flicked her gaze to the window. Across the street, a black car idled, with the river glimmering behind it, its tailpipe writing a slow smoke paragraph into the damp air. Human government, yes. but the geometry of the vehicle's windows, one pane too small, one angle too precise, told another story. Someone else had borrowed a human silhouette and gotten the details not quite wrong enough to be unnoticed. She felt the old trained stillness take her, the discipline that had made her good at being a scientist and dangerous at being a mother. She walked toward the window as if admiring the way the rain had cleared. Daniel followed with his eyes and no questions. That, too, she noticed. At recess, the playground's chatter rose like a tide outside. Daniel lifted a crate of library books onto a table and propped open the covers, as if opening windows in the floor. He glanced at Serenya. "We go to the library after lunch," he said. "It's a block away, if that's all right." Serenya considered security vectors and exposure risks, and the way Lyra's shoulders had dropped when Daniel said, "library," like a breath after a long belt. "It is acceptable," she said. Then, because she had seen how words could be bridges, she added, "Thank you." They walked under clouds that hadn't decided yet if they were finished with the day. The town was stitched with porches and flags and old trees that seemed to know the names of everyone who passed. Lyra kept pace with Daniel, not holding his hand, not needing to. He moved at her rhythm, without advertising the fact. Serenya stayed a half step behind, watching reflections in shop windows, listening for a hum that did not belong to air. Twice she almost reached to adjust the hood on Lyra's coat. Twice she stopped and let the child arrange her own weather. The library was small and perfect, the kind of place where a bell over the door would have been saccharine, if not for the librarian's smile making it true. The floorboards spoke in a polite Greek language. Daniel led Lyra to the astronomy shelf, which was 3 shelves, and to the picture books, which were many. He took down a slim volume with a constellation wheel folded into the cover and set it on the table like an invitation. Lyra touched the wheel. It turned with a click, bringing the month into alignment with a narrow window of stars. She looked through that window as though it were a keyhole. Serenya ran her scanner across the book, across Lyra's wrists, across the air between child and paper, measuring nothing but everything, trying to be something. The harmonic from earlier brushed her palm again when Daniel began to read stuff. A voice meant for both rooms, the one with the table and the one inside Lyra, where the archive slept. Once, long ago, he read, people looked up and made patterns so they could remember their way home. Lyra's gaze did not leave the wheel, but her mouth moved around the shape of home, tasting it for the first time as if it were a new fruit. A tremor slipped through Serenya. Her people had a word like that, too, a syllable you only learned at the lattice, when an elder pressed a memory onto your skin through light. She swallowed. The door bell chimed. 2 men entered wearing the kind of jackets that made them look like they wanted people to notice their absence more than their presence. They fanned out with the unstudied caution of those who have practiced it too much. One pretended to consult a map posted by the printer. The other picked up a magazine and turned the pages without looking at the paper. Serenya felt the subsonic thrum she had been waiting for, the one that told her the world had tilted half a degree toward danger. Daniel put the book down mid-sentence and lifted his head just enough to see them without moving his body. He closed the book over the constellation wheel with a fingertip that said, "Wait to the child, and we will handle this to the mother." He did not touch Serenya, but she felt the reassurance as if he had taken her elbow. "Miss Vall," he said, loud enough for the librarian, soft enough for her. "Shall we return to school? The storm might circle back." He was making a shape for her to step into. She stepped. Lyra came away from the table with reluctance and trust braided together. Daniel blamed an invented forgotten umbrella for their hurry. The librarian waved at Lyra, small ritual of blessing, and they slipped back into the gray light. Back in the classroom, Lyra went to the board without prompting. She lifted a stick of blue chalk this time, cool as metal, and added a curve beneath the bridge, then a cluster of minute points within the curve. Serenya knew that geometry. It was a cradle schema, the blueprint of the beacon arrays her people had built long ago to call their wandering ships home when the dark thickened. The encoded archive inside Lyra was not merely stirring, it was seeking to signal. Serenya crossed the room in 3 quiet strides and erased the new marks with the side of her hand. Chalk dust flared like a startled ghost. Lyra made a small sound, not protest, not fear, acknowledgement of a border. Daniel's eyes sharpened. He did not speak. Serenya lowered her hand, and the white palm of it, smeared with blue, looked like a map of an ocean someone had tried to hide. Some patterns are stories, she said, forcing her voice to be even. Some are doors. Doors attract those who like to come uninvited. Lyra looked from the board to the window. The black car was gone. In its place was a reflection in the glass of someone who might have been a woman, or a man, or a carefully built absence. The liaison's message chimed again, the same word, auditors. But now it wore a second pulse underneath. A frequency Serenya had learned in her first year of fieldwork, and had hoped never to hear again. It translated, imprecisely, to "We are almost at your door." Daniel moved to the cupboard and opened it, as if checking on supplies. He took out a roll of tape, a handful of index cards, a simple classroom compass, a box of mirrors used for a science unit. He set them on the counter one by one, a quiet inventory. "We'll cover the board for now," he said. "We'll say the class is practicing blind contour drawing. It'll be a mess." He looked at the mirrors, at the dusty triangle of light on the floor. "If anyone comes, we'll keep the room bright." Serenya blinked. "Why bright?" "Shadows are where people imagine power," he said. "Light is where people behave." He hesitated, and then, with a shyness that surprised her, offered a small tin mug. "Tea. It's not an instrument, but sometimes it holds a person together." The mug warmed her fingers. In its reflection she saw the chalk on her skin, the edge of Lyra's sleeve, Daniel's face, steady as a horizon. The room smelled faintly of lemon and paper, and something else she could not name. Feeling traversed the narrow bridge between distrust and the kind of trust that is not foolishness but decision. She made that decision. "Tomorrow," she said, tasting each syllable as if it might crumble, "if your auditors come, you will not call them mine." "No," he said simply. "And if the others come, the ones who aren't yours, you will not try to be brave, in the way that gets people remembered badly." He smiled, and in his smile was weather. Storms he had walked through and weathered. "I'm a teacher," he said. "I prefer the kind of brave that gets people home." Lyra tugged Serenya's sleeve. The child held up her palm. On the skin where chalk had smudged, the dust had gathered in a pattern not drawn by her fingers' dots, a line, a dot. A tiny version of the beacon array had formed itself where heat and oil met powder. The archive was learning their bodies as language. A low hum shivered the glass in the windows. Not a car, not the ancient pipes hidden in the walls. Something high, masked, triangulating. Serenya lifted her gaze. Through the wavering reflection, she watched a contrail cut the sky in a line too straight to be human, then bend into a shape that had not been seen over this town since the first time. People on this land made patterns from the stars to remember their way home. The bell for dismissal would ring in 12 minutes. In 12 minutes, the doors would open, and children would pour into the brightness, with their backpacks flapping like wings. There are a dozen kinds of courage, Serenya thought. The one she needed now was to remain in the room and make it look ordinary. Daniel nodded once, as if she had spoken aloud. He walked to the board and, with a grin that belonged to another day, another life, drew a silly lupacat with lopsided whiskers and said in his lesson voice, "All right, artists. Today we draw what we cannot quite see yet." Lyra laughed, a sound like a star dropping into water. The humming in the glass grew a fraction louder. The schoolhouse lay in uneasy quiet after the children had gone, a silence too deep for an ordinary afternoon. Sunlight washed long bars across the desks, turning chalk dust into drifting constellations. Serenya stood by the window, her pulse as precise as the readout on her wristband. The alien frequencies she had feared were no longer circling above. They had landed somewhere beyond the neat streets and painted porches of the town. Someone was already walking toward them. Daniel moved with careful steadiness, closing blinds, lowering shades, turning the classroom into a dim cocoon. He was not trained for this, Serenya thought, yet he carried himself as if danger was not an intruder, but a student he had been expecting. He lifted the box of mirrors from the science shelf and set them on the counter. He spread index cards, tape, and pencils into a scatter of tools. His calmness was not a mask, it was the kind of calm born of years convincing frightened children that tests and storms would pass. Lyra sat at her desk, her small shoulders rising and falling in a rhythm that was not only her own. Serenya could hear it now, faint but growing, the resonance of the archive awakening inside her child. Stirred by drawings, stories, and the human teacher's voice, it was dangerous. It was miraculous. If the wrong hands touched that resonance, it would be stripped and weaponized. The memory of a people turned into a map for conquest. Serenya crossed the room to Daniel, her voice pitched low. They are here, not your auditors, not your government, others. They know the code has begun to stir. Daniel's eyes flicked toward Lyra, then back to Serenya, and they'll come through that door. His voice held no panic, only preparation. They will come through any door, Serenya said. Walls mean nothing to them. He considered this, then touched one of the mirrors, tilting it until a slice of light struck the board. Then we won't fight them with walls, he said. We'll fight them with windows. Serenya frowned, not understanding, but Lyra lifted her head, her gaze locking on the play of light against the slate. She whispered, "Windows. Open," and the chalk in her pocket rattled faintly, answering her like a bell. Outside, footsteps scraped on gravel. The sound was deliberate, not hurried predators announcing themselves. Serenya felt her every nerve tighten. She positioned herself between the door and her daughter. Daniel, instead of stepping back, moved forward, planting himself a few feet from the entrance. His presence was not aggressive, but solid, as if saying, "If you want the child, you must first pass through me." The knob turned. The door opened, a fraction. A figure leaned in, wearing the shape of a human but with edges too precise, a smile that bent wrong at the corners. Its eyes flicked across the room, scanning. "Observer Vol," it said, its voice rippling with an undertone too metallic for flesh. "We have come for the lattice child. Yield her, and you will be spared." Lyra shrank into her seat, clutching the chalk. Serenya's throat went dry, but before she could answer, Daniel spoke, his tone the same one he used for late parents and overconfident principals. "This is a school. You're trespassing. Leave now." The intruder's smile widened, unbothered. "You are no soldier. You are no scientist. You are irrelevant." Its gaze shifted toward Lyra, hungry. In that moment, the mirrors Daniel had placed caught the fading sun. Light splintered across the walls, bouncing into unpredictable angles, scattering the intruder's projection. The figure staggered, its outlines stuttering. Serenya realized he wasn't breaking their power, but disrupting their perception. For beings who bent light to hide their forms, reflection was poison. "Go," Daniel said again, firmer. "You don't belong here." The figure hissed, recoiling. Behind it, Serenya could feel others circling, waiting for the right crack in defenses. But Lyra, watching the light dance, leaped from her chair. She drew on the blackboard with desperate strokes, a circle, a bridge, a cluster of dots. Her small voice rose, trembling yet fierce. Home, light, safe. The symbols burned brighter than chalk should allow. Serenya felt her wristband spike, registering frequencies that belonged to stars long dead. The archive inside Lyra was no longer dormant. It was answering the world around it, and its answer was loud. The intruder shrieked, retreating into the corridor. The resonance was too much for it. Serenya rushed to the board, half terrified, half in awe. Her daughter had not only drawn a pattern, she had opened a beacon. The air hummed, alive, ready to carry across galaxies. Daniel caught her shoulder, steadying her. What did she just do? She called the memory awake, Serenya whispered, her voice breaking. She called it to protect us. From outside came the screech of tires, the echo of retreat. But Serenya knew this was only the beginning. Others would come, stronger, hungrier. The beacon had been lit, and once lit, it could not be unseen. Lyra turned, chalk dust on her cheeks like stardust. They won't stop, she said in her fragile, trembling voice. They'll come again. Serenya wrapped her arms around her daughter, but her eyes met Daniel's over the child's head. For the first time since she arrived on Earth, the scientist's voice shook. Then we will need more than science, she said. We will need you. Night folded over the town like a deep blue blanket, and the school took on the hush of places that have witnessed something sacred and are afraid to breathe too loudly afterward. The chalk glow on the board had faded to an ordinary smudge, but the air still carried an aftertaste of music, as if a bell had been struck hours ago and the metal was stubbornly holding its last shimmer. Daniel propped open the classroom windows to let the warm night pass through. Serenya dimmed the lights to a hum. Lyra curled on a rug with a library book tucked like a small shield against her chest and drifted into a troubled half-sleep. Serenya pulled a rolling whiteboard to the center of the room and began to redraw Lyra's pattern with a precision that came from years of measuring realities others only felt. Daniel stood at her shoulder, not close enough to crowd, close enough to steady. She sketched the circle, the bridge, the interior constellation, then added the 3 tiny marks Lyra had given their human names: home, light, safe. Each point was a number, each number a chord. Serenya's wristband picked up a frequency inside the graphite lines that should not have existed. It hummed to her touch like living wire. It isn't only a beacon, she said, her voice low. It's an index. My people encoded our hereditary memory into lattice nodes long ago. When the lattice began to fail, some of us hid the index in our children. The map tells us how to rethread the past into the living. She paused, swallowing the difficult shape of the next words. Lyra holds the only complete index I have seen in 10 years. Daniel exhaled, something between awe and anger softening into care. And those others want to steal it, copy it, strip it, Serenya said, and use what remains as a leash. She traced the bridge gently. This line used to be taught with song. The elders would place a hand here. She pressed her palm over the chalk, and you would feel the hum through bone. We called it the path between what was and what could still be. Daniel turned the mirror, so a bar of moonlight fell along that chalk bridge, silver running over white. The light made the graphite sing a little louder on her wristband, a brightening that wasn't volume so much as clarity. He smiled, not at her, but at what the world was willing to show when invited. Tell me what you need, he said. Quiet, she said. Time, a safe perimeter, and your voice when she wakes. She looked at him then, eyes catching his, before sliding away, embarrassed by how much she was asking for, and how little she could promise in return. Her system responds to cadence. The archive listens when hope ends your sentences. He made a soft, surprised sound, a laugh that knew it had no right to be here and came anyway. I can do hope, he said, and it wasn't bravado. It was a simple truth he'd earned by escorting children across hard days and harder nights. Serenya's fingers fluttered near the board, then stilled. I wasn't trained to be a mother, she said without meaning to. The confession startled her, as if someone else had borrowed her mouth. I was trained to be a good scientist, but sometimes science taught me to measure the place where Fear ends instead of the place where love begins. I have been unskilled at hope. Daniel's hand hovered above her elbow, asking permission with its distance. You sound like half the parents who sit in those chairs, he said, nodding toward the small plastic seats lined against the wall. The ones who think they're doing it wrong because it doesn't look like how it looked yesterday. The truth is, love's messy, chalk dust everywhere. He smiled a little. We clean it off together. Something eased in Serenya, the brittle angle of her training softening into a curve that felt more like a path. She reached out, placed her palm against the bridge she had drawn, and sang a fragment of the old lesson, one syllable, then another, a thread of tone that had slipped her for years, and now returned with the humility of a lost child. The chalk trembled. Lyra stirred on the rug and murmured in her sleep, an echo answering an echo. The doorknob clicked. Serenya's jaw tightened. Daniel's eyes flitted to the clock. 10:17 p.m. He moved toward the door with the calm of a man who has built 1,000 small rituals around unwelcome interruptions. He opened it a sliver dot. 2 new figures stood in the hallway. These wore no wrong smiles. They wore human bureaucracy like armor. Badges flashed. Auditors, the tall one said. We received a report of after-hours occupancy. Serenya did not let herself flinch. She stepped to the door, folding her hands to hide the tremor of adrenaline in her fingertips. Her training snapped into place. I filed clearance, she said. Observer Protocol 43. The shorter auditor's gaze slid past her toward the floor, where the edge of the chalk map peaked. It lingered too long. We'll need to inspect the premises, he said. And the child. Daniel's voice did not raise, but it wove itself between the auditor's words, like a knot. We can schedule a walkthrough during business hours, he said. Tonight is not appropriate. This is an emergency review, the tall one replied. The superintendent has authorized immediate access. Daniel met Serenya's eyes. In that small exchange, entire plans traveled. He shifted his weight, as if considering whether to step aside. Instead, he moved a fraction into the doorway, his shoulder a hinge. The auditors could not pass without touching him. Then call the superintendent, he said. I'll wait. We don't need a call, the shorter one snapped. We need compliance. Lyra woke on the rug and sat up, hair sleep-tangled, eyes enormous. The auditor's attention snapped. To her, predatory Serenya felt the room tilt. She took a half-step forward, but Daniel's palm lifted slightly. Give me 1 second. He was gambling on something. Trust, she realized. The gamble was trust. He looked at Lyra and smiled as if this were any other night, any other threshold. Hey, Star Watcher, he said, letting the last word warm. Do you remember how we practiced breathing? In 4, hold for 2, out for 6. Like waves. Lyra's chest followed his rhythm. Serenya's wristband flared. The chalk map brightened, almost invisibly. A pulse folded into moonlight. The auditors did not notice, but something else did. From the corridor, beyond the bureaucrat's shoulders, a shadow stiffened, then shrank. A wrong smile flickered and vanished. The not-quite-human watchers had come draped in paper authority, trying the softer door before the harder one. Stepped into the gap Daniel had made and let one more confession find daylight. You want to see protocol? She said to the auditors, her voice cool. The scientist returned. Here is mine. She reached to the board and added a line in red chalk, crossing the bridge at an angle that would look meaningless to human eyes and unmistakable to the ones hiding behind them. It turned the index from invitation to warning. Award, ancient and binding. If the right voice spoke it, she spoke it. The hallway air trembled. The tall auditor went gray under his human color. The shorter one blinked rapidly, and for a second his eyes did not catch the light like a human's should. A hiss shuddered from the corridor's farther end, the sound of something retreating through a space too small for its ego. Daniel filled the silence. the way he always did, with an ordinary kindness that left no room for monsters to preen. "Gentlemen," he said, "we'll make you copies of whatever forms you need tomorrow. Tonight, this child sleeps." The tall auditor swallowed. The shorter one reached for anger and came up with only paperwork. "We'll file a notice," he muttered. "That's the spirit," Daniel said, almost cheerful. He closed the door on them with a softness that felt like a door closing on winter. Lyra's breathing steadied. The red line Serenya had drawn settled into the chalk constellation, like a stitch tying two edges of fabric. She swayed with relief, a sudden weakness spilling through her knees. Daniel's hand was there, actual now, warm and steady, guiding her to the nearest chair. "I forgot how to stand," she whispered, shocked at herself. "People forget all kinds of things when the world knocks too loud," he said. "That's why we teach each other again." She looked at him, truly looked, all the shields she used to make sense of strangers slowly lowering. He was not a hero in the way the archives told stories. He was a man who remembered to breathe, who bent mirrors and moonlight toward goodness, who stood in doors not to own them, but to make sure the right people moved through. Her heart recognized him the way her instruments had recognized Lyra's first whisper. Not with data, with belonging. Lyra patted over and slid her small hand into Serenya's. "You sang?" she said sleepily, wonder tucked inside the words. "I remembered," Serenya answered, and tears she had not anticipated threatened the edges of her eyes. "Because he reminded me how they worked together then, through the thin hours, tracing and retracing the index until the board held a map that could only be read by the right kind of witness, part science, part story, part mother's steady hand." When Lyra faltered, Daniel's voice found the shore for her again. When Serenya's training tried to become a cage, Daniel's ordinary courage picked the lock. Near dawn, the frequency shifted one final time. The chalk lines did not brighten. They deepened, as if they'd sunk roots into the slate. Serenya's wristband vibrated once, and stilled. The index was awake and hidden. The others would have to walk through hope to find it now, and hope was a terrain they did not know how to cross. Serenya leaned back. Exhaustion and a quiet, fierce joy braided through her. She did not know how they would meet the next wave. She only knew they would meet it together. She turned to Daniel, intending to thank him, but gratitude felt too small for the thing he had given her. Outside, the sky paled, the first birds testing morning with small brave songs. Lyra looked between them as if understanding the language of what had just started. She rested her head on the edge of the table, closing her eyes. "Tomorrow," Daniel said softly, "we'll teach the class a new story, one about how to stand together without making a sound." Serenya nodded, a smile finding her that felt like sunrise. Somewhere, deeper than fear and older than science. An old star listened in this time. It leaned closer. The dawn came with a false sense of peace. The town outside Riverfield Elementary stretched into ordinary life, trucks rumbling to the grain depot, mothers calling two children on bicycles, a dog barking at the postman. Yet inside the classroom, serenity was an illusion stretched thin. Serenya's wristband pulsed every few minutes with warnings she didn't share aloud. The index was no longer dormant. Lyra's drawings had awakened something vast and bright, and once awakened, such light could not stay hidden long. Daniel noticed the shadows under Serenya's eyes as she rubbed the chalk dust from her palms. "You didn't sleep," he said, not accusing, simply naming a truth. "I have not slept well in years," she answered. "Dreams are not safe for me." Lyra sat at the back table, sketching quietly on paper instead of the board. A small concession Serenya had insisted upon, but the patterns she traced even in pencil shimmered with significance. Daniel leaned over her shoulder, pointing to the curves, asking questions as if they were just the doodles of a bright child. Lyra smiled faintly, a soundless smile, but a smile nonetheless. Serenya had not seen it in years. The moment broke with the arrival of the liaison. He entered briskly, tie straight, voice clipped. Auditors will return today at noon. The superintendent insists on observing the child. You will cooperate. His eyes flicked too quickly across the chalkboard, too quickly toward Lyra's small hands. Serenya stiffened. Noon, Daniel asked. That gives us 2 hours of quiet lessons. The liaison's lips tightened. Do not mistake courtesy for indulgence. Protocol demands review. He left with a click of the door. When the lock snapped, Serenya exhaled. He is not only liaison, his cadence is wrong. Something else is wearing him. Daniel nodded slowly. Then we don't let him write the story. The morning lesson began. Children trickled in, unaware of the storm coiled above their heads. They laughed, argued over crayons, recited multiplication tables. Daniel kept his tone steady, his movements gentle, weaving calm into the air. Serenya observed, half scientist, half mother, realizing the ordinary was its own form of shield. Then Lyra stood. Without prompting, she walked to the board. Chalk in hand, she drew a spiral tight, elegant, shimmering faintly where dust met. Light. The other children fell silent, watching. A boy whispered, "It looks like a galaxy." Serenya's heart stuttered. She recognized the spiral, the archive of dawn, the ancient root of her people's memory. Her training screamed to stop, her daughter. But Daniel caught her wrist lightly. His eyes said, "Wait." Lyra pressed the chalk hard for the last line. The spiral flared brighter than sunlight should have allowed, then dimmed. The children gasped and clapped. To them it was art. To Serenya, it was revelation. The archive was no longer just whispering. It was speaking. The floor trembled. Only Serenya and Lyra noticed. A vibration too subtle for human senses, but deep as tectonic plates shifting. Serenya knew at once. "They are here," she whispered. The windows darkened. Outside, the sky rippled as though a stone had been dropped into its fabric. Figures stepped through the distortion. They wore human shapes, but their joints bent wrong. Their shadows lagged a fraction behind. 3, then 5, then more. Daniel moved quickly, calm as if orchestrating a fire drill. "Children, games in the gym, now." His tone left no room for fear. The students obeyed, filing out under the guidance of a teaching aide who had no idea what prowled the edges of reality. Only Lyra remained, her small fists clenched around chalk. The intruders entered. Their leader smiled a smile stretched to wide. "The lattice child," it said, voice layered with echoes. "She will come with us. She belongs to the memory. She belongs to herself," Daniel answered. He stood between them and the girl, no weapon in his hand, only certainty. The leader tilted its head. "Teacher, you are irrelevant. Step aside." But Serenya stepped forward too, her voice sharp. "You misunderstand. This is not only a child. She is the index. If you touch her, you will unravel what you cannot control. The archive is not a chain, it is fire." The intruder's grin thinned. "Then let it burn." They advanced. Daniel grabbed the mirrors from the cupboard, angling them to catch the overhead lights. Beams fractured, scattering across the intruders' bodies. Their forms shimmered, glitching, unable to hold shape in a web of reflections. Serenya added her wristband's pulse, projecting interference. The air warped with color, disorienting. Them? Lyra rose on her toes and pressed chalk against the board. With quick, desperate strokes, she drew a star inside the spiral. "Safe," she whispered. The star ignited. Light poured from the chalkboard, flooding the room with brilliance, so fierce the intruders staggered back, shielding their eyes. The leader screamed, not in pain, but in fury. "The child has opened the path." Serenya felt the truth in her bones. The archive was awake. Every constellation Lyra drew was a key. Every key unlocked another door of her people's memory. But the light was a beacon. Others across the galaxy would see it. Allies and enemies alike. The intruders retreated, their shapes flickering, their threat unfinished. "This is not over," the leader hissed. "You cannot hide what shines." When they vanished, silence rang louder than battle. Daniel's shoulders sagged, but his eyes stayed on Lyra. She was trembling. Chalk dust smeared across her cheeks like war paint, but her gaze was steady. "I called the light," she said softly, and it listened. Serenya knelt, holding her daughter close, though her voice cracked with fear. "You must not do that again without warning. You don't understand what you carry." Daniel crouched beside them, his hand on the back of Lyra's chair. His voice was quiet but unyielding. "She understands more than either of us. She knows this is bigger than fear." Serenya looked at him, really looked. The human teacher, who spoke with ordinary hope, had just stared down beings that bent reality. She realized, with a start that shook her, that her people's survival might depend not on her science, but on his belief. Beyond the glass, the sky cleared to a deceptively calm blue. But Serenya knew what it meant. The war for Lyra had begun, and the next time the intruders came, they would not leave without taking something or breaking everything. She turned to Daniel, her voice hushed but certain. "We will need more than lessons and chalk. We will need you." He met her gaze with a quiet nod. "Then you'll have me." The blue sky over Riverfield was a lie. Serenya knew it the way she knew the trembling pulse of the archive in her daughter's chest, calm on the surface, but beneath, currents dark and fast. She walked the school halls with Daniel, her wristband set to constant scan, and every few minutes it registered ghost signatures along the edge of town. The intruders had not gone. They were circling, waiting. Lyra sat in the classroom by the board, tracing spirals and bridges in pencil now, as though practicing scales before a song. She hummed softly under her breath, not a melody Serenya knew, but one her wristband translated into pulses of light on its display. The archive was no longer whispering, it was singing through the child. Every note was both gift and threat. Daniel glanced at the door, then at Serenya. "They'll come again, won't they?" She nodded, her voice tight. "The beacon is awake. It is too bright to remain unseen. They will come, and next time they will bring more than shadows." He rubbed his palm along the frame of the chalkboard, as if grounding himself in wood and dust. "Then we prepare." Preparation was not his alone. Word had spread in the small town that something unusual was stirring at the school. Parents lingered after drop-off. Teachers exchanged worried looks in the staff room. Daniel told them only what they needed. "We'll keep the children safe." But Serenya caught the glances of suspicion, too. The liaison had whispered rumors, questions, curled like smoke. Who was this strange woman and her quiet daughter? Why did government cars idle at the edges of their streets? That evening, Daniel invited Serenya and Lyra to his home, a modest place with creaking steps and walls lined with books. The living room smelled of cedar and tea. Lyra curled into a blanket on the couch, drawing galaxies across Daniel's old notepad. Serenya stood stiff near the shelf, scanning titles she didn't understand: history, poetry, education manuals. "You keep records of stories," she murmured. Daniel poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to her. "We keep what matters. Numbers tell us how high we've built. Stories tell us why we bothered." She accepted the cup, her hands brushing his. Heat darted through her fingers, unexpected, unwelcome, yet not unpleasant. She turned away quickly, ashamed of how much it steadied her. She was a scientist, not someone meant for comfort. Yet as Lyra drifted to sleep, her small breaths shallow but steady, Serenya found herself sitting near Daniel at the kitchen table, their voices hushed in the glow of a single lamp. He asked about her people. She told him more than she'd told anyone outside her kind. How the lattice was once sung into every newborn's bones. How the stars carried their stories. How silence fell when the lattice fractured. She admitted she had given her child the burden of carrying what an entire people could not. "And now?" he asked. Now she carries more than she should, Serenya whispered, her throat tight, and I am afraid she will break. Daniel studied her, the way he studied children on the edge of tears, with patience and no judgment. Or she. Shine brighter, because she knows she isn't carrying it alone. Serenya looked at him sharply. Do not promise what you cannot keep. If they come for her, they will not stop at you. He leaned closer, his voice low and steady. Then they'll find out teachers are harder to break than they think. The words hit her deeper than she expected. She had always believed strength came from knowledge, from precision. But Daniel's strength was different, rooted in trust, stubborn hope, and a refusal to move when it mattered. For the first time, she felt herself leaning not on training, but on another person. The closeness unsettled her hand, steadied her all at once. Before she could answer, Lyra stirred. Her voice, small and trembling, rose from the couch. There near, Serenya's wristband flared red. Multiple signatures. Too many. She rushed to the window. Across the street, the shadows thickened unnaturally. Figures peeled themselves from the darkness, wrong-jointed and grinning. This time they did not hide behind badges. This time they came as they were, predators, wearing fragile masks of humanity. Daniel moved quickly, pulling the curtains shut, checking locks. Serenya gathered Lyra, her arms tightening around her daughter's fragile frame. The child's eyes glowed faintly, starlight threading through her pupils. The archive is awake, Lyra whispered. It wants to speak. No, Serenya said, panic slicing her voice. Not yet. It will draw them all. But Lyra pressed her small palm to her mother's chest. It will keep us safe. The house shuddered. The intruders pressed against the walls, their forms flickering in and out of light. The sound of their claws or hands scraped the wood. Serenya's breath caught. This was no longer a test of patience. This was the strike she had feared. Daniel dragged a heavy bookshelf across the door, his movements efficient, practiced. He grabbed the mirrors from his classroom bag. He had carried them home, expecting this, and placed them to scatter the lamp's glow into sharp, confusing angles. The intruders hissed outside, their shapes glitching. Serenya activated her wristband, layering interference fields across the room. The air crackled, but the shield would not hold long. She turned to Daniel, fear raw in her voice. They will breach. When they do, you must take Lyra and run. He shook his head, his jaw set. No, we don't run, we stand. The walls bowed, a window shattered, a figure spilled inside, its grin splitting too wide, its hands too long. Lyra screamed. Serenya prepared to unleash every last reserve of her science. But Daniel stepped in front of them, his hand raised not in violence, but in defiance. You will not touch her, he said. His voice did not tremble. For a heartbeat, the intruder hesitated. Light fractured across the mirrors, hitting Lyra's eyes. She rose from her mother's arms, chalk still clutched in her fist. She drew a single star in the air, glowing, suspended, impossible. The archive poured through her. The intruder recoiled, shrieking. More shadows pressed at the walls, but the star's light spread, weaving into lines, forming a pattern of protection around the house. Serenya felt tears sting her eyes. Lyra was no longer only carrying memory, she was wielding it. Daniel reached for Serenya's hand, steady and sure. She's not alone, he whispered. The house blazed with light. The intruders howled and retreated, their forms unraveling in the brilliance. But Serenya knew this was no victory. It was a declaration. The universe had heard the daughter of stars speak, and now every friend and foe would turn toward Earth. She held Daniel's hand tighter, her voice breaking. This was only the beginning. Lyra's small voice, soft but fierce, answered from the glow. Then let them come. Morning found Riverfield scrubbed bright, the kind of clear light that makes even fear look like it might be reasoned with. Daniel brewed coffee, strong enough to stand a spoon upright. and Serenya stood at his kitchen window with Lyra in her arms, watching the town wake. Cars nosed into driveways. Sprinklers spun small rainbows. To anyone else, it was just a Tuesday. To Serena's wristband, the sky hummed with approaching attention, silent as the intake of breath before a choir begins to sing. They walked to the school by the long way, slower than usual, as if stretching minutes could stretch safety. At the crossing, a bus driver tipped 2 fingers off his cap. A woman watering her flowers paused to stare, curiosity first, suspicion next, and then, when her gaze fell on Lyra's small hand woven into Daniel's, a softness that had nothing to do with understanding and everything to do with recognition. People know the weight of a child being protected by the time they reached the classroom. Teachers from the other wing had drifted in on their prep period, which somehow lasted longer than usual. Daniel explained as much as he dared. There would be visitors, some pretending to be people they weren't, some not even pretending. They would ask to take Lyra. No one would let them. He said it not like a rallying cry, but like a rule of the building. No running, no gum, no giving up the daughter of stars. Serenya rolled out the portable whiteboard and redrew the index a final time. Strokes sure. Red ward line threading through the bridge. Lyra added a spiral in the center, then turned to Daniel the way a singer turns to the conductor before a difficult passage. He nodded once. He didn't ask her to be brave. He reminded her she already was. At noon, the liaison returned with new auditors, and behind them, more of the wrong smile kind. They crowded the doorway, the hall behind them rippling with static. The air tasted like metal and old storms. The leader stepped forward, face smoothed into something that would have read, as handsome if it hadn't been so hungry. "We will take the lattice child now," it said. "The archive belongs to its makers." Daniel stepped into the center aisle, hands at his sides. "She's not a possession. She's a person. And this is a school. You'll need to show better manners than that." The leader's mouth creased, baffled by the idea of manners as a defense. "We tire of this." Serenya breathed once and set her palm to the bridge on the board. Lyra's fingers found her mother's, then slid to lace with Daniel's. The contact completed a circuit that wasn't electricity but something older. Chalk dust rose like silver pollen. "Ready?" Daniel asked, looking not at the strangers, but at Lyra. Lyra nodded. The smallest smile flickered across her mouth, a star tested behind clouds. "Tell me a story," she whispered. He began, not a lecture, not a command, a story, about a town called Riverfield that had more porches than fences, about a classroom, where a chalkboard turned into a night sky, about a girl who carried a library inside her, and a mother who had learned to sing again. He kept his sentences ending in hope. Serenya felt it, the harmonic he always loosened from the air, the cadence. That made her sensors warm. The archive listened. Lyra lifted the chalk and drew in time to Daniel's words. Circle, bridge, cluster, star, each stroke anchored, not just to the slate, but to the room, to the scuffed floor where children had sat crisscrossed applesauce, to the books that smelled like old paper and rain, to the windows where moths, sometimes for a day, believed in glass. The shapes glowed not bright, not blinding, but true. Serenya heard the lattice in her bones. The old song unfurled across her skin. The one she had thought the universe had dropped. The leader flinched, then shoved forward. "Stop her." They poured into the room. Mirrors snapped light across their faces and turned them into their own worst angles. Teachers stepped into doorways the way Daniel did, bodies forming an ordinary wall. The liaison tried to push past, then faltered when the red chalk line on the board brightened. Serenya spoke the ward word again, the one old enough to have edges. The hallway behind the wrong smiles wavered. Whatever hid inside the liaison ducked. Lyra drew the last line of the spiral, and whispered a word that made Serenya's stomach drop and soar at once. "Open." The chalkboard did not shine. It deepened. The black became not surface, but space. Through it, stars answered, as if the slate had remembered it was once rock under a night and decided to act accordingly. The room held its breath. In the sky, beyond the ceiling, something very far away heard a child in a brick school whisper and turned its face toward Earth. The first reply came as a wind that moved nothing but still made the paper on Daniel's desk lift. Serenya knew that feel. Not atmosphere, attention. A lattice node, waking in a place so distant human numbers feel nervous naming it. Another answered. Then, another. The archive was unfurling along lines she had tried to calculate for 10 years, and failed because the missing variable had not been met. It had been a human voice ending sentences with hope. The leader screamed, "Turn it off." Lyra shook her head. No. One of the wrong smiles lunged. Serenya moved too slow. Daniel did not. He caught the attacker's wrist and twisted, not brutally, just enough to remind it that this shape had joints. It stumbled. Another rushed. A second-grade teacher, 60 years old, cardigan and Osmacked, it across the face with a rolled-up attendance chart. In the gym, the aide, sensing something she couldn't see, began a game of clap and deco. Children's hands slapped in a pattern that bounced down the hall like a heartbeat. The mirrors multiplied it. Light and rhythm webbed the school. "Listen," Daniel said to the room that was also the board, that was also the sky. He wasn't speaking to the intruders. He was speaking to the far places. She is not a weapon. She is a library asking for readers. Something shifted in the black of the board. Not a picture, a presence. The slate's darkness lifted into a shimmer that read as language to no one and everyone, light that could be read by skin, sound that could be heard by bone. Serenya saw, as if through a window that was also a memory, the shapes of her people gathered around an old lattice. She heard their unanswered singing finally echoed. The index in Lyra's chest blossomed, and for a breathtaking second, she felt every story she thought lost. Take a breath. A final phrase threaded through. One no archive had ever yielded to her scanners. Not math. A line of prophecy encoded not in symbols, but in timing. She understood it because Daniel was still speaking, his cadence laying the path. In her tongue. It translated imperfectly. When the daughter of stars stands in the house of learning, and a ward keeps the door, the lost lattice will weave upon the human cadence. Then the children of earth will guide the stars. Serenya reeled. The ward. In her language it meant keeper of thresholds, the one who stands between danger and light. She looked at Daniel Ward, and felt the universe click into alignment, with a soft, devastating grace. The missing element was not an energy source, or a frequency. It was a person, a teacher, whose job name had been a prophecy all along. The leader saw the shift in her face, and lunged one last time, desperate. Lyra didn't draw. She turned. She raised her small hand and spoke in both languages at once, the words folding together like two rivers meeting. "I am not your vessel. I am the bridge." The ward line flared. The wrong smiles faltered, bound by a law older than aggression. When a living index chooses, the choice is sovereign. They could not cross a threshold guarded by a ward. They fled, not vanishing in triumph, but recoiling, as if they had stepped barefoot onto truth. The liaison sagged against the doorframe like someone waking from a bad dream. The room exhaled. In the gym, the clapping game turned to laughter. Lyra didn't smile. She lifted her hand to the board, palm to night. "Are you there?" she whispered, not to the strangers, not to the dangerous, but to the ones who had waited a long time to be remembered. The answer came as a low glow that warmed the chalk under her skin. Serenya felt the return of what her people had always believed was home, not a place, but a voice answering back. The broadcast completed itself. No trumpet, no fireworks, just a certainty settling into the world. The lost lattice caught, not like a snared animal, but like a seed finally finding soil. Silence came, not empty, but finished. Daniel lowered his hands. Teachers sagged into chairs, their bravery turning back into ordinary kindness. The liaison slid down the wall, dazed, blinking, human again. Serenya wanted to laugh, cry, sleep for a century. Instead, she looked at Daniel with the kind of gratitude that changes the grammar of futures. "You were the missing variable," she said. It sounded inadequate and exactly right. He shook his head. "No, we all were. You, Lyra, the kids, the librarian. Riverfield, I just held the door." "The ward," she said, and when he frowned, she told him the translation. He looked embarrassed and oddly moved, as if someone had just complimented the way he tied his shoes. Lyra slid her small hand into both of theirs. "Can we go outside?" she asked, as if this were normal, as if there were recess after saving a civilization. They did. The sky over Riverfield seemed unchanged. Blue softened to afternoon gold. But stars can hide in daytime and still know exactly where they are. Serenya felt its threads running from this town to places beyond maps, living lines that would carry teaching and hope both ways. Her people would rebuild, and they would rebuild with human rhythm stitched into the lattice. The archive had never wanted to be pure. It had wanted to be true. In the weeks that followed, nothing and everything changed. Children still forgot lunches. Buses still ran late. But at night, if you knew when to look, new constellations appeared. A small curve like a bridge, a cluster like a classroom, a red stitch like a line that protects. People on other worlds pointed up and told stories that ended in hope, the way Daniel had taught them, and somehow their instruments worked better when they did. Serenya stayed, not because she couldn't leave, but because the prophecy had not been about a single broadcast, it had been about a partnership. She set up a lab in the school library after hours. The librarian made a face at the equipment, and then knitted a cozy. Daniel wrote a new unit called Light, You Can Hear. Lyra enrolled as a student, and when the teacher asked the children to draw their favorite place, she drew a chalkboard with a night where a wall should be. On a warm evening in June, and Daniel stood on the school steps, while the town's summer band tuned unevenly in the parking lot. Lyra chased fireflies, laughing when they winked out, and reappeared like shy stars. Serenya reached for Daniel's hand, then paused. He met her gaze, and took hers instead, that steady, teacher grip that had lifted children and now lifted her. It wasn't a declaration. It was an answer to a question she hadn't known how to ask. "You'll keep standing in the door," she murmured. "As long as there's a door," he said. "And when there isn't, we'll draw one." She leaned her shoulder into his, an intimacy as gentle as gravity. Somewhere above them, an old star listened, and, this time, she felt it smile. Lyra ran back and tucked herself between them, looking up with the solemn happiness of someone who has found the shape of her family. "I'm not only the daughter of stars," she said. "I'm a student of Earth." And there it was. The final line of a story that felt like it had been waiting to be told since the universe first learned to dream. Humanity, underestimated and ordinary, had taught the cosmos how to end a sentence in hope.